The most dangerous man in America just told her he still loved her. Then he forgot to turn it off. And Vivian Moretti, the wife of the most powerful mafia boss in the country, sits alone in a dark room, listening to her husband's laughter mingle with the laughter of her best friend. Not the laughter of a colleague, not the laughter of a friend. It's the sound that exists only between two people sharing a secret and a bed. If you're reading this story, please like and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because this is just the beginning. Pa. The phone was still warm in her hand. Vivian hadn't moved in 4 minutes. She knew because the clock on the mantel across the room had ticked 47 times since the voice on the other end stopped speaking directly to her and started speaking to someone else. Low, easy, intimate, the voice of a man completely at home in the skin of his deception. She knew that voice. She had fallen asleep to it for 11 years. The penthouse suite at the Aldrin. She recognized the background noise now, the way the ventilation system in that building hummed at a specific pitch during the winter months, the distant sound of jazz filtering up from the lounge on the 42nd floor. Cassian had taken her there for their 6th anniversary. He'd ordered her champagne she didn't finish and laughed at the way she kicked her heels off the moment the elevator doors closed. She remembered thinking she had married the only man in America who could run a criminal empire and still find a way to make her feel like the only woman in any room. She had been wrong about a great many things. The laugh came through the speaker again. His laugh, the one that started low in his chest and rolled outward when something genuinely surprised him. And beneath it, closer to the microphone, she heard the other voice, light and familiar. The voice she had known since she was 19 years old, sitting in a lecture hall at Harrington University with rain hammering the windows and a girl with dark curls sliding into the seat beside her and whispering, "You're going to want to move." They open the back door and the wind is brutal. Celine. Vivian set the phone face down on the side table. She did not end the call. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine perfectly straight, and her breathing measured the way her mother had taught her. 3 counts in, hold for 4, release for 7, and whatever you're feeling will wait until you decide it's allowed to exist. She breathed. She waited. She listened to her husband laugh with her best friend in a hotel she had memories in. The feeling did not wait. It arrived like a blade entering between 2 ribs, precise, cold, and devastating in its quietness. The Moretti estate sat on 40 acres outside of Westfield, Connecticut, behind a stone wall that had taken 2 years to build and a gate system that cost more than most people's houses. Vivian had chosen the property herself, had spent 3 weeks with architects and landscape designers arguing over sightlines and drainage and the placement of the oak trees along the eastern approach. Cassian had told her to do whatever she wanted with it. He'd signed the papers without looking at them and kissed the top of her head and gone back to the city, and she had poured herself into building something that felt like permanence. She had wanted permanence badly in those years. They both had. It was different now. She sat in the library, her library, with her books and her cataloging system and the reading chair she'd had reupholstered twice, until the clock struck 11 and the house had gone completely quiet. The phone on the table had gone dark an hour ago. She didn't know when Cassian had ended the call or if he'd ever realized it had been open. She didn't particularly care. Whatever he'd said after that laugh had not been intended for her, and she had not needed to hear it. She already had what she needed. Not proof, not yet, but something older and colder than proof. She had certainty. The kind that settled into the body and didn't ask permission and didn't leave room for the comfortable lies people tell themselves when the truth is too expensive. She was not confused. She was not catastrophizing. She was not, as Cassian had said to her 3 times in the last year, in that careful, clinical tone he used when he wanted to manage her without appearing to manage her, reading into things. She was a woman who had just heard her husband's laugh in a hotel room with another woman's voice underneath it, and she had known both of them long enough to understand exactly what she was hearing. She pulled the leather journal from the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she'd kept since the miscarriage, because her therapist had told her to write things down, and Vivian had found that writing things down was the only way to keep the grief from becoming something she couldn't control. And she opened it to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, what I know, what I can prove, what I need. Then she sat back and began to think. Hut. Cassian Moretti came home the next afternoon. He moved through the front door the way he always did, coat already off, handed to the attendant before the threshold, jacket unbuttoned, the particular set of his shoulders that meant the city had exhausted him, but he was choosing not to show it. He was 51 years old and still moved like a man who occupied more physical space than his actual body required. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that had never quite softened with age, the kind of face that made people in rooms look at him before they understood why. She was in the kitchen when he found her, standing at the island with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, going through invoices from the estate management company. Normal things. Ordinary posture. She had chosen the kitchen deliberately. It was neutral ground, bright light, no shadows for either of them to hide in. "You're home early," she said, without looking up. "Finished what I needed to finish." He went to the cabinet above the espresso machine and took down a glass. "How was last night?" "Quiet." "I called." "You did." She turned a page. "I didn't pick up. I was tired." He poured water, drank half of it, set the glass down with the particular deliberateness he used when he was choosing not to respond to something. She had catalogued his silences over 11 years, the way a translator catalogues syntax. Each one had a different weight, a different function. This one was, "I know you're lying, and I'm choosing not to press it, because pressing it costs me something." "I've got the commission dinner Thursday," he said. "The Ferraro family's flying in from Chicago." "I know. I confirmed the table arrangements last week. I'd like you there." She looked up then, because looking up was what a woman who didn't know anything would do. Present, engaged, meeting his eyes across the kitchen island the way wives did. She had a very specific image of herself that she needed to maintain right now, and she intended to maintain it with precision. "Of course," she said. "I'll pull something from the closet." He watched her for a moment. Cassian Moretti had built an empire on reading people, on walking into rooms full of dangerous men and knowing within 60 seconds exactly where the power sat and who was lying and which smile was covering which intention. He was not a man who missed things, but he had been missing her for a long time now, and she thought perhaps he'd gotten used to it. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired." "The grief counselor." "I stopped seeing her in October." She said it evenly, like a fact about the weather. It wasn't helping. Something moved through his expression. The shadow of a thing she might once have called guilt, though she had no interest in naming it anymore. He nodded once, slowly, and left the kitchen, and she listened to his footsteps move up the stairs and turned back to her invoices. Her hand was not shaking. She was almost proud of that. 3 days later, she called Marcus Hale. Marcus was a lawyer. Not her lawyer. Not officially. Not in any way that would appear in the Moretti financial records or be visible to any of the men who monitored those records as a function of their employment. Marcus was the attorney she had first consulted 8 years ago, before the marriage, when her father's estate had needed untangling after his death, and she had maintained a quiet, professional relationship with him ever since. Cassian knew Marcus existed. Cassian did not know that Vivian had been in contact with him 4 times in the last 3 years. Or why. She met him in a coffee shop in Norwalk, 40 minutes from Westfield, at a corner table near the back where the ambient noise was sufficient and the sight lines to the door were clear. Marcus was 63, with the kind of careful, unhurried demeanor that made him easy to underestimate, until you were sitting across a conference table from him and realized he had spent the last hour handing you a rope while you built yourself a noose. He set his coffee down and looked at her with the expression of a man who had already read the room before she opened her mouth. "Tell me what happened," he said. She told him. All of it. The phone call. The hotel. Celine. The months of careful distance that she had attributed to grief, her own grief, drowning both of them. And the slow, creeping sense she had been building since the spring that something in the architecture of her marriage had shifted in a way she couldn't name. She told him about the financial documents she'd found in July, the ones she hadn't understood until she'd spent 2 weeks teaching herself enough about shell company structures to understand what she was looking at. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned his coffee cup a quarter rotation and said, "What do you need from me right now?" "I need to know what I can take with me," she said. When this is done. When? When? He looked at her for a long moment. You understand what you're starting? I understand exactly what I'm starting. Cassian is going to... I know what Cassian is going to do. She folded her hands on the table. That's why I'm sitting here instead of asking him. Marcus took a breath, turned the cup again, and began to talk. The Ashcroft fortune was her mother's family's textile money, old and quiet, the kind of wealth that didn't display itself because it had never needed to. When Vivian's father died and her mother had already been gone 3 years, the estate had passed to Vivian in full, the trust accounts, the property in 4 states, the private investment vehicles her grandfather had established in 1961, and nobody had touched since. She had brought that into the marriage because Cassian had asked her to, and because at 29 she had trusted him the way you trust someone when trust is still uncomplicated by evidence. The trouble, the specific legal trouble that Marcus had spent the last 40 minutes outlining for her in a voice so calm it could have been a weather report, was that over the course of 11 years, the Ashcroft assets had been progressively entangled with Moretti Syndicate holdings in ways that were not accidental and were not invisible to anyone who knew where to look. Shell companies, nominee shareholders, property transfers, the kind of patient, methodical asset consolidation that took years to accomplish and required a lawyer who understood both corporate law and the particular language of organized crime structures. Someone built this deliberately, Marcus said, over a long period of time. I know. Who would have had access to Celine? The name sat on the table between them like something dropped. She's a forensic accountant. She structured half of Cassian's legitimate holdings before they were together, before I knew they were together. Marcus was quiet. She photographed my financial journals, Vivian said. I found evidence of it. She had access to my private study because I gave it to her. Because she was my best friend and she sometimes stayed in the house when I was traveling, and I trusted her the way I trusted... She stopped, breathed. It doesn't matter why I trusted her. The point is she used it. The point, Marcus said carefully, is that this is not just an affair. No. If what you're describing is accurate, then what they've built is a mechanism to remove you from the legal framework of this marriage in a way that leaves you with nothing, emotionally destabilized, financially isolated. And if they can make the commission believe you're all unstable, she said the word for him because she was done letting it be euphemistic, erratic, unfit for the role of Dawn's wife. Yes, I've read those encrypted messages too. Marcus looked at her differently then. Not with pity. She would have stood up and walked out if she'd seen pity, but with something closer to a recalibration. How long have you had those? Long enough. She picked up her coffee. Long enough to also know that 3 of Cassian's capos have been quietly loyal to my family's interests since before this marriage existed, and that at least one of them has been uncomfortable with the direction the last year has been moving. You've been building this. I have been protecting myself. She set the cup down. That's not the same thing. She drove home through the gray Connecticut afternoon with the heat on high and a headache pressing in behind her right eye and the particular weight of a woman who has crossed a threshold she cannot uncross. The road narrowed between bare trees. The estate gate opened at her approach, and she pulled up the drive and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. There was a grief she had put to the side for this. The miscarriage had wrecked her. She was not going to pretend it hadn't, was not going to perform some kind of fortified stoicism about the fact that she had lost the child she had wanted with a desperation that surprised even her. 8 weeks, and she had already been building a future around it. 8 weeks, and then the hospital, and then the silence, and then Cassian, who had held her hand in the waiting room and looked at her with something that had seemed, in those terrible hours, like genuine devastation. She wondered now whether it had been. She wondered a great many things she had no way of unraveling, which moments had been real and which had been performance, and where exactly the man she married had become the man she was now building a legal case against. It was possible she would never know the precise location of that shift. It was possible it had been a slow drift rather than a single turn, and that there was no clean line to point at. It was also possible that none of it mattered, and that what mattered was what came next. She got out of the car. Inside, on the kitchen island, someone had left a single document. The guest list for Thursday's commission dinner, printed in Cassian's assistant's clean sans-serif font, with a handwritten note in the margin. Check the seating, Celine is coming. The handwriting was Cassian's. He had written it as a courtesy, an informational note from a husband to a wife. Heads up, your old friend will be there. Figured you'd want to know. Vivian read it twice. She set it back on the counter with the same care one might use placing something fragile. Then she went upstairs to her study, locked the door, opened the safe behind the bookcase, and pulled out the folder she had been building for 6 weeks. Documents, photographs, printed transcripts of encrypted messages, a USB drive with surveillance footage from a camera she had installed in the hallway outside her own study 3 months ago after she'd noticed a mark on the door she couldn't explain. She sat at her desk and she spread everything in front of her and she began to think about Thursday. Celine Voss arrived at the Moretti estate at 6:45, 20 minutes ahead of the first commission families, in a black dress that cost what some people paid in rent, her dark curls pinned up the way she always wore them for formal occasions. She came through the door the way she always came through that door, comfortable, proprietary, the ease of someone who had been welcome in a place long enough to stop noticing the welcome. Vivian was at the top of the stairs. She watched Celine hand her coat to the attendant and look up and see her, and she watched Celine's face produce the expression it always produced. Warmth, affection, the bright particular smile of a woman who believed she was beloved. Viv. She opened her arms. Vivian came down the stairs and let herself be embraced. She returned it. Celine smelled like the same perfume she'd worn for 10 years, cedar and something floral, clean and distinctive. And Vivian held the hug for exactly the right number of seconds and then stepped back and smiled. "You look incredible," she said. "So do you. Are you feeling better? You look—" Celine tilted her head. "You look clearer, somehow." "I've been sleeping," Vivian said. "Come, let me get you a drink before the others arrive." She guided Celine toward the drawing room with a hand at the small of her back, warm and familiar, and felt the woman's shoulder relax under her palm, and thought, "You have no idea what tonight is." Behind her left ear, her pulse was completely steady. The drawing room filled quickly. The Ferraro brothers from Chicago, both of them enormous and gregarious in the way of men who have never needed to make themselves small. The Dantini family out of Baltimore, 3 independent capos whose territories stretched across the mid-Atlantic, and Armand Voss, Celine's fiancé, who arrived at 7:15 in a charcoal suit with the slightly distracted air of a man attending a function he didn't fully understand and hadn't been fully briefed on. Vivian had met Armand twice before tonight. He was 38, had inherited his family's shipping business at 26 and turned it into something considerably larger, and had the particular quality of a man who was intelligent about what he knew and knew almost nothing about what he didn't know. He had no idea what Celine was. He had no idea what he was standing inside. She felt something sharp and unwelcome when she looked at him. Not pity, exactly. Something in the family of pity that had enough anger in it to keep it from being soft. Cassian found her near the window at 7:30, touched her elbow, and bent his head toward hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For tonight." "Of course, femme," she said. He looked at her. Up close his eyes were the dark gray of winter water, and they still had the quality she had noticed the very first time she'd looked into them. The quality of a man who was always calculating but was very good at letting you forget he was doing it. "You seem good," he said. "I am good." She smiled at him. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Dinner was served at 8. The table was long and formal and candlelit, and Vivian sat at one end and Cassian at the other, and in between them the families of America's organized underworld ate and drank and performed the ritual of powerful men in rooms with other powerful men. It was a kind of theater she had mastered over 11 years. The right questions for the right people, the way to make a Ferraro laugh, the particular deference the Dantini patriarch expected from a woman at a table, and the precise way to deliver it so he didn't notice she was managing him. Celine sat across from Armand and laughed at the right moments, and touched Armand's arm and was, as she had always been, the most effortlessly social person in any room. Vivian watched her. Not constantly, not obviously, just the way you watch something you've spent enough time studying that you no longer need to concentrate. At 9:40, when the dessert was being cleared and the table was loud with conversation, and the second bottles were being opened, Vivienne excused herself, went to the powder room off the front hallway, and remained there for 4 minutes. When she returned to the table, she sat down, reached across, and touched Armand's arm, the briefest contact, a light and social gesture, and said, "Armand, I'm so sorry. Would you come with me for a moment? I have something I need to ask you privately. It won't take long." He looked mildly surprised but agreeable. They stepped into the hallway. She handed him the envelope. It was thin, 4 photographs and a printed transcript, 2 pages. She watched him open it. She watched his face. She did not watch the moment of understanding arrive. She looked at the wall above his left shoulder and breathed at an even rate and waited for him to finish reading and looked back at him only when she heard him stop turning pages. His face was the face of a man whose scaffolding had just been removed. "I'm sorry," she said, and she was. In the specific way she was sorry for him and not for what she was doing. "I thought you deserved to know." She left him standing in the hallway with the envelope and returned to the table. Across the room, Celine was laughing at something one of the Ferraro brothers had said. Her chin was tilted up and her hair caught the candlelight, and she looked like a woman without a single thought of consequence in her head. Vivienne poured herself a glass of water and waited. It did not take long. The sound that came from the hallway was not loud. It was the sound of a door handle, footsteps, and then Armand Voss appearing in the doorway of the dining room with the envelope in his hand and the particular stillness of a man who had just had to very rapidly decide who he was. The table didn't notice immediately. Then it did. Then Celine turned. In the silence that followed, Vivienne set her water glass down. Cassian looked at her from the other end of the table. She looked back. She had never in 11 years seen him unable to read a room. He was reading this one now, moving through it fast, calculating, and she watched the precise moment he reached the right conclusion, and she watched his face when he got there, and she held his gaze and didn't move, and for the first time in months she felt something that wasn't grief. Armand Voss said Celine's name. Just the name. Once. And Celine's face, for the first time in the years Vivienne had known her, had absolutely nowhere to go. The commission heads at that table were not men who missed subtext. They were men who had built entire careers on reading the air in rooms, on understanding exactly what was happening beneath whatever surface was being presented. Vivienne watched them register it. The envelope, Armand's face, Celine's stillness, Cassian at the far end of the table with his jaw locked and his hands flat on the white linen. Old Ferraro, who had known Cassian for 30 years, looked down the table at him with something that was not quite an expression. It was an adjustment, a recalibration of a very specific kind. Vivienne folded her napkin and set it beside her plate. Tomorrow, she thought, she would call Marcus and tell him to file the papers. Tonight, she would remain exactly where she was, at the head of the table she had built, in the house she had chosen, in the life she was not going to surrender quietly, and let the men in this room draw their own conclusions. She reached for her water glass. Her hand was not shaking. It had not shaken once. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known, sitting in that candlelit room while a marriage disintegrated and a reputation cracked, and the most powerful men in the American underworld recalculated everything they thought they understood about the Moretti household, was that Cassian had been on the phone that morning with someone she hadn't identified yet, someone who was not Celine, someone whose number appeared once in the encrypted logs she'd recovered and then was gone, scrubbed with the kind of thoroughness that suggested not carelessness, but the very deliberate removal of a thread. And whoever that thread led to had information about Vivienne that she had never told Cassian. Information she had not told anyone. She would not discover this until it was too late to be surprised by it quietly. She would discover it in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment, when she was already exposed, already committed, already standing in the open with everything she had built laid out for the commission to examine. But that was not tonight. Tonight, she was winning. Armand Voss left the dining room at 9:53. He didn't make a scene. That was the thing nobody at the table would talk about afterward, but all of them would remember. He didn't raise his voice, didn't throw the envelope, didn't do any of the things a man in that situation might be expected to do. in front of the heads of 5 crime families and their respective entourages. He simply stood in the doorway for 11 seconds with the photographs in his hand and looked at Celine with the particular expression of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him was never solid to begin with, and then he turned and walked out. The front door closed. Not a slam, just a close. The dining room held its silence for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then Dantini's wife said something quiet to the woman beside her, and the Ferraro brothers exchanged a look that carried the weight of a full conversation, and the room slowly, carefully resumed the performance of a dinner party. Forks lifted, glasses refilled, someone laughed at something that wasn't funny. While underneath all of it, the air had changed in a way that everyone present understood, and nobody was going to acknowledge directly. Not here, not tonight, not in front of Cassian Moretti. Celine had not moved. She sat at the table with her hands in her lap and her face arranged into an expression that was not quite composed and not quite shattered, something in between, something that Vivian recognized as the look of a woman running calculations at speed, assessing damage, trying to determine which version of a response cost her the least. She had always been fast. Even at 19, even in crisis, Celine processed before she reacted, and it had always been one of the things Vivian had admired about her. Now she watched it happen and felt something cold and tired move through her chest. Cassian spoke first. His voice was even. "Vivian?" "Yes." "Why don't we give our guests a moment?" It was not a question. "Of course." She rose from the table. "Please, everyone. The drawing room is open. We have brandy, and the Ferraro boys haven't finished the story about Naples that I interrupted before dinner." It was the right tone. It gave people somewhere to move toward, a social permission slip, and the room began to redistribute itself with the relief of people released from an unbearable stillness. Within 4 minutes, the dining room contained only the 3 of them, Cassian, Celine, and Vivian, and the wreckage of a formal dinner laid out in candlelight like a stage set for something no one had bothered to write the ending of yet. Cassian pushed back from the table and stood. He did not look at Celine. He looked at Vivian. "Outside," he said. The back terrace was cold. January in Connecticut had a specific quality of cold, not dramatic, not howling, just a gray and settled freezing that got into the joints and stayed there. She had forgotten her shawl, and she was not going to go back for it. Cassian closed the terrace door behind them and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her with the expression she had spent 11 years learning. The one that was not anger yet, but was the thing that lived directly before anger, the pressurized stillness of a man deciding how much of himself to show. "That was calculated," he said. "Yes. You went through my... I didn't go through anything of yours." She turned to face him directly. "I went through mine, my financial records, my study, my journals, which someone had been photographing." She let that sit for a moment. "Someone with access to this house. Someone I trusted." Something moved through his face. Not guilt, or if it was guilt, it was buried under too many other things to identify cleanly. "You don't know what you're... Don't." Her voice was quiet, and she kept it that way deliberately because quiet was more dangerous than loud, and they both knew it. "Cassian, do not tell me what I know. I sat in this marriage for 11 years, and I built this house, and I buried our child, and I stood beside you at every table and every dinner and every commission meeting where I was required to be present and be appropriate and be useful. And I am telling you that I know exactly what I saw and exactly what I heard and exactly what I found. So don't." He was quiet. The muscle in his jaw worked once. "The commission families are in my drawing room," he said finally. "They are. What you just did in there... What I just did in there was tell a man the truth about his fiancée." She held his gaze. "If the commission has questions about why I felt that was necessary, I'm prepared to answer them." The cold sat between them. "You're prepared," he repeated, and something in his voice had shifted. Something flatter, more careful, the voice he used in rooms with men who were trying to take something from him. She had never heard him use that voice with her before tonight. "What does that mean, Vivian? What exactly are you prepared for?" "I've retained counsel," she said. Marcus Hale. You know who he is." A pause. Yes. He'll be filing papers Monday. The silence after that was a different kind of silence, the kind with actual weight, the kind that pressed. Cassian took his hands out of his pockets. He looked at the frozen garden beyond the terrace railing and then looked back at her, and for one moment, one brief, unguarded moment, she saw something that was not calculation, not management, not the specific performance of controlled power he'd been doing since she'd handed that envelope to Armand. She saw something that might have been, in another life, in another version of this, something close to grief. Then it was gone. "We should go back inside," he said. "We should," she agreed. They went back inside. Celine was gone. She had slipped out during the 15 minutes Vivian and Cassian had been on the terrace. Coat retrieved, car called, exit completed with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood when a room had turned against her and did not stay to feel it happen. One of the attendants told Vivian this at the drawing room door, eyes carefully averted, voice carefully neutral. "She said to tell you she'd call tomorrow," the attendant added. "Thank you," Vivian said. She would not call tomorrow. Vivian knew this the way she knew most things she'd spent 11 years observing, not from evidence but from the accumulated understanding of a person's patterns. Celine did not make calls when she was regrouping. She went quiet, she assessed, she decided on a strategy, and then she emerged with something prepared. It was the same thing she'd always done, in small conflicts and large ones, in college disputes and professional crises. The difference now was that Vivian wasn't waiting for the emergence. She moved through the drawing room with the ease of a hostess who had not just detonated a controlled explosion in her own dining room, because this was what 11 years had given her. The ability to hold two entirely separate realities in her body simultaneously and perform one while living in the other. She refreshed old Ferraro's brandy. She laughed at the Naples story, which turned out to involve a stolen speedboat and a carabinieri captain with a spectacular mustache. She was present and warm and exactly who everyone in that room expected her to be. She felt Cassian watching her from across the room for most of the evening. She did not acknowledge it. The last guests left at midnight. Cassian went directly to his study. Vivian went upstairs, locked the door of the guest room she had quietly migrated to 3 weeks ago. She had told him it was because his schedule woke her, which he had accepted without comment, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let herself shake for the first time since she'd handed Armand that envelope. Not fear. The shaking wasn't fear. It was the body releasing something it had been holding under enormous pressure, the way a hand cramps after gripping something too tightly for too long. She breathed through it and let it run its course, and when it was done, she sat with the stillness that came after and thought about the unknown phone number in the encrypted logs. One contact, scrubbed, gone. She had 3 people she trusted to ask about it, and one of them was a capo named Vincent Rua, who had served her father before he served Cassian, and who had 6 months ago found a reason to sit beside her at a family dinner and say very quietly and very carefully, "Mrs. Moretti, if you ever need anything moved carefully, I'm the man for it." She had noted it, filed it, not acted on it. She reached for her phone. Vincent Rua was a careful man. He had survived 31 years in the Moretti syndicate by being the kind of careful that other men dismissed as boring, the kind that paid attention to paperwork, kept his name off unnecessary documents, never drank past his second glass at functions, and maintained a perfectly calibrated invisibility that had kept him alive through 4 leadership transitions and 2 federal investigations. He was 60 years old and looked 50, and thought like a man who had already considered every outcome and was simply waiting to see which one arrived. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Moretti." No surprise, just acknowledgement. "I need to show you something," she said. "Not by phone. Tomorrow morning. There's a hardware store on Cullen Road in Darien. I'm there at 9 most Saturdays. I'll find it." He hung up before she did. "What?" The hardware store smelled like machine oil and sawdust, and the particular cold of a building that had been heated inconsistently for decades. Vincent was examining cabinet hinges when she walked in, and he did not look up, and she walked to the adjacent aisle and pretended to read the back of a package of weather stripping. "The number," she said quietly without looking at him. "In the encrypted file, the one that was removed." "I know the number," he said. She waited. That's Dominic Reyes, Vincent said. He runs federal liaison, not officially. Nothing Reyes does is official. But he's the man who handles the commission's relationship with certain people in the Justice Department. When the families need something made quiet, or when the government needs something made accessible, Reyes is the conversation. The weather stripping was very interesting. She looked at it carefully. Why would Cassian be calling him? 3 possibilities. Vincent set down the hinges and picked up a different set. 1, he's reporting something to the commission before they hear it from someone else. 2, he's making a preemptive arrangement about assets, the kind you make when you're anticipating a legal action and you want certain things protected before the papers are filed. 3, he paused. 3 is that someone told Reyes about you specifically, and Reyes is being used to build a file that says you're a liability. She absorbed that. A liability to whom? To the commission. If they believe the Don's wife is a unpredictable element, someone who might be moved to make decisions that could expose the syndicate, someone who needs to be managed. The words sat in her hands like the weather stripping she was still pretending to read. They'd move against me, she said. Not a question. They'd move against the situation, Vincent said carefully. It wouldn't be personal. It never is with the commission, but personal and lethal aren't the same category. She set the package back on the shelf. How long have you known about this? 3 weeks. I heard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I've been waiting to see how the situation developed. It developed last night. I heard. He finally looked at her, briefly, sideways, the look of a man delivering a verdict he'd already made. You moved faster than I expected. I had to. She turned to face the shelf. Is Reyes someone I can reach? No, Reyes is commission property. He can't be approached by a civilian. I'm not a civilian. You're not a Don either, not yet. He set the hinges in his basket. But the men who could make that case to the commission, there are 3 of them who would listen. 2 of them owe your father a debt they've never had an occasion to repay. Those debts don't expire. She breathed in the oil and sawdust smell of the hardware store and thought about her father, a man who had moved through the edges of this world without ever being consumed by it, who had cultivated relationships across every territory in the country because he believed that relationships were the only currency that didn't devalue. He had told her once, when she was 16 and had asked him why he spent so much time at dinners with men she found frightening. Because someday, Vivian, you will need something that no amount of money can purchase, and on that day you will want to already know the person who has it. She had thought he was talking about himself. She understood now he had been talking about her. Tell me their names, she said. The papers were filed Monday at 11:42 in the morning in the Family Court Division of Fairfield County by Marcus Hale's senior associate, a woman named Petra Sung, who had the demeanor of someone who had filed contentious divorce papers in organized crime-adjacent cases enough times to have developed a very specific and highly functional absence of affect. Cassian's attorney received notification at 12:15. Cassian called Vivian at 12:22. She let it ring. He called again at 12:31. She picked up on the 3rd ring. You filed. His voice was controlled, barely. I did. Vivian. A pause, and in the pause was something she couldn't fully categorize. The quality of it was not just anger, not just calculation. There was something raw underneath both of those things, something she might once have spent considerable energy trying to understand and excavate. She didn't have the capacity for that anymore. This is not... You don't understand what this is going to... I understand exactly what it's going to do. She was in the library, standing at the window, watching the frozen lawn. It's going to make public that I'm contesting every financial instrument that was constructed around my family's assets without my informed consent. It's going to make public that those instruments were built in a very specific way over a very specific period of time. And it's going to raise questions with the court about the nature of that construction that I think will be very interesting for a number of parties. Silence. Marcus is very thorough, she added. He's been thorough for 8 years. You should probably tell your people that. Vivian. His voice had changed, dropped, quieted, And she recognized this version too, had heard it in the hospital corridor, in the dark at 2 in the morning after the miscarriage, in the particular moments when the architecture of who Cassian Moretti was publicly had fallen away and left something underneath that was human and damaged and real. She didn't know anymore how much of that had been genuine. She was not going to let the uncertainty stop her. We can, if you want to talk. If you want to sit down and actually talk without the lawyers, I'm asking you to. We needed to talk 7 months ago, she said. We needed to talk the night I came home from the hospital and you stayed in the city. We needed to talk about 100 things, and we didn't. And I spent 6 of those months thinking it was my grief, my withdrawal, my failure to reach across what happened between us. She stopped, breathed. And then I heard your voice in that hotel, and I understood that the distance wasn't grief. It was logistics. You were building something, and you needed me to stay in my corner while you built it. A long pause. It wasn't like that, he said. Tell me what it was like. He didn't. That's what I thought, she said, and ended the call. Celine called at 4 in the afternoon. Vivian picked up. I'm not going to apologize, Celine said before Vivian could speak. I didn't ask you to. I need you to understand, Celine. Her voice was not unkind. That was the thing that surprised even her. She had expected rage, had braced for the specific heat of betrayal by someone loved, and instead what she felt was a long, exhausted sadness. The sadness of recognizing a thing too late and understanding you'd had every warning and chosen not to see them. I'm not calling the commission. I'm not going to the press. I'm going to do this through the courts, which is the only place in this entire world where what Cassian has done to my family's money actually matters to anyone who has the power to stop it. That's all I'm doing. I'm not coming for you personally. Armand left, Celine said. Her voice was flat. He left last night. He's not... I know. That was mine. The flatness cracked, just slightly, on the last word. That was the one thing in this that was... Viv, I know you're... Don't. And now something hot did arrive, briefly, burning through the exhaustion. Don't tell me what Armand was to you. Don't do that. You know what you did. You know every specific choice you made, and you made them while sitting in my house and sleeping in my guest room and holding my hand at the hospital. And I'm not going to stand here and comfort you about the consequences of any of it. Silence on the line, long enough that Vivian thought Celine might have ended the call. I never wanted you hurt, Celine said finally. I know, Vivian said, and she did know. She believed it, even now, which was perhaps the most complicated thing about all of it. Celine had not wanted her hurt. Celine had simply wanted what she wanted badly enough to do it anyway. Those two things lived together in people, and she had spent 30 years learning that and had still somehow not fully prepared herself for the cost of that lesson. It doesn't change anything. She hung up. Outside, the sky had gone the deep gray of late afternoon in January, and the oak trees along the eastern approach were black against it, bare and enormous and very still. She stood at the window for a long time. The call from Dominic Reyes came at 9 o'clock that evening. She didn't know the number. She almost didn't pick up. Something, instinct, or something colder than instinct, made her answer. Mrs. Moretti. The voice was mild, the voice of a man who kept everything mild as a professional discipline. I think we should meet. Her grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? Someone who's been following recent events with considerable interest. A pause. I understand you've spoken with Vincent Rua. The cold moved down her spine. Vincent. She thought of the hardware store, the careful sideways glance, the 31 years of survival. What do you want? She said. A conversation, nothing more. I'm not an adversary, Mrs. Moretti. I want you to understand that before we meet. I'm a mediating party. The commission has asked me to reach out. The commission, she repeated. They're aware of the filing. They're aware of the dinner last Thursday. They have concerns, let's say, about the direction this situation is moving, and they'd like to explore whether there's a path that's productive for all parties. She understood what that meant. She had been in this world long enough to understand that productive for all parties in the vocabulary of the Commission meant resolved before it becomes a problem for the Commission, which could mean anything from a negotiated settlement to something considerably less negotiable. When? She said. Friday. There's a hotel in Midtown, say, the Caldwell on 53rd. Noon. I'll need to bring my attorney. A pause. Of course. He ended the call. She sat in the dark of the library for a very long time. Then she called Marcus. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been expecting her call, which told her something about what he already knew, which meant that the situation had moved into a different register. No longer a legal case being built in relative quiet, no longer the careful private work of a woman collecting evidence in her own home. It was something else now. Something with more people in it, more moving parts, more danger of a kind that didn't resolve in courtrooms. The Commission reached out, she said. I know, Marcus said. I got a call 20 minutes ago from Reyes directly. He's not hostile, Vivian. He's commission, which means he's transactional. He's not going to come at you. But he might come at the case. He's going to try to broker a settlement that protects the syndicate's exposure, which means he's going to try to get you to accept terms that look generous on the surface and strip you of everything structural. I know. She stared at the ceiling. What don't I know yet? Marcus was quiet for a moment. There's a second filing. Cassian's people filed a counter today. A petition challenging your legal competency to make financial decisions on the grounds of... He paused, and she heard the careful selection of words. Documented emotional instability following a traumatic loss. There it was. She had known it was coming. She had seen it in the encrypted messages, had watched the architecture of it being built across months of correspondence between Cassian and Celine. She had known and prepared and built her counter-argument with Marcus across 4 separate meetings, and still, hearing it said plainly, emotional instability, traumatic loss, she felt something tighten in her throat with a force that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that she had actually been in that hospital, had actually lost that child, had actually spent the months afterwards so hollowed out by grief that there had been days she'd sat in this library for 4 hours without moving, and the idea that someone had watched her survive that and decided to turn it into a weapon was something that she could not yet fully name without risking the steadiness she had spent 3 weeks constructing. She breathed. 3 counts in, hold for 4, release for 7. How bad is it? She said. It's a pressure tactic, Marcus said. They don't have enough to make it stick in court. What they have is enough to slow things down, create noise, make the Commission nervous about a prolonged public proceeding. That's the point. They want you to feel like the walls are closing and take whatever Reyes puts on the table Friday. And if I don't? Then we go to the Commission meeting with everything we have, and we make the case that Cassian committed financial fraud against his own wife using syndicate infrastructure, which is a problem for every family at that table because it means the Moretti syndicate has been running dirty in ways nobody approved. Will they listen? The 2 men Vincent identified will listen. Whether they'll act depends on how clean our presentation is and whether you can hold the room. He paused. Can you hold the room, Vivian? She thought about Thursday night, the candlelight, the steadiness of her own hands, the way old Ferraro had looked down the table at Cassian with that quiet, devastating recalibration behind his eyes. Yes, she said. Then Friday is a test, Marcus said. Reyes is going to put something in front of you designed to look like the only exit. Your job is to sit in that room and let him finish and then tell him you need 72 hours to review it. And then we go to the Commission before he can reframe the narrative. She closed her eyes. The oak trees outside were invisible now in the dark, but she knew exactly where they stood. She had placed every one of them, had argued about the spacing, had watched them take root over years until they looked like they had always been there, like the land itself had grown them. She had built things that lasted. She would build this too. Friday, she said. I'll be there. She ended the call and sat in the silence of the house she had made, and somewhere on the floor above her she could hear Cassian moving, his footsteps crossing the bedroom, the sound of a door, the particular rhythm of a man pacing in a room at the end of something he had not expected to end this way. She did not feel sorry for him. She felt the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had been surviving for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply live. And underneath that exhaustion, something harder and quieter, something that had been growing since the night she'd sat in the dark with a phone in her hand and heard his laugh. Friday was coming. And Vivian Moretti was not going to that room to negotiate. She was going to walk in, let Dominic Reyes say every word he had prepared, and then she was going to place on that table the one piece of evidence she had not yet shown anyone. The piece that didn't just prove the affair, didn't just prove the financial conspiracy, but proved that Cassian had known about Reyes's involvement before the filing, had coordinated with him before she ever called Marcus, had been building an exit from this marriage that ran directly through the commission itself. She had found it 4 days ago. She had told no one. She was saving it for the room where it would do the most damage. The Caldwell Hotel on 53rd Street was the kind of place that didn't advertise itself. No marquee, no doorman in a costume, just a brushed steel number above a recessed entrance and the understanding that people who needed to find it already knew where it was. Vivian arrived 12 minutes early in a car she'd arranged herself, not one of the Moretti vehicles, and sat in the lobby with Marcus beside her and a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and watched the room the way Cassian had taught her to watch rooms, which was the particular irony she chose not to examine too closely. Dominic Reyes was already there. He was smaller than she'd expected, compact, 60s, with the kind of unremarkable face that was itself a professional asset, the face of a man who could sit in any room in America and be forgotten within minutes of leaving it. He stood when they approached, shook Marcus's hand, shook hers, and gestured to the table with the courtesy of a man conducting a meeting about quarterly projections. "Mrs. Moretti, thank you for coming." "Mr. Reyes." They sat. A woman Reyes had brought, younger, dark suit, no expression, placed a folder on the table and did not open it. "I'll be direct," Reyes said. "The commission appreciates directness, and I think you do too, so." He folded his hands. "The situation as it currently stands creates exposure for a number of parties that extends well beyond your marriage. The financial structures in question, and I'm not here to debate their origin or intent, that's a matter for the courts if it gets that far. Those structures touch 7 separate syndicate operations across 4 states. Any prolonged legal discovery process creates a visibility problem that the commission is not willing to accept." That sounds like a problem Cassian should have considered before he built them," Vivian said. Reyes looked at her with the mild, attentive expression of a man who had been said things to across tables for 40 years and had long ago stopped being moved by any of them. "Perhaps. Nevertheless, the situation is what it is. The commission is prepared to offer the following." He nodded to the woman, who opened the folder and slid it across the table. "Full release of the Ashcroft Trust accounts. Unencumbered, return to your sole control. A cash settlement of $14 million, structured as a spousal distribution, non-taxable. The property in Vermont and the Connecticut estate transferred to your name outright. In exchange, the divorce proceeds as uncontested. All discovery requests are withdrawn, and you agree to a non-disclosure regarding the nature of any syndicate financial instruments you may have encountered during the marriage." Marcus had the folder. He was reading it with the careful neutrality of a man who had trained himself not to react to numbers. Vivian looked at Reyes. "And the competency petition?" "Withdrawn. Immediately. Unconditionally." "That's a generous offer," Marcus said, without looking up. "The commission is motivated to resolve this cleanly," Reyes said. Vivian picked up her coffee, remembered she didn't want it, set it back down. She looked at the folder. $14 million. The estate. The trust. On paper, it looked like winning. On paper, it was more than most people in her position would have been given, more than she would have had if she hadn't filed, more than Cassian had intended her to walk away with when he and Celine had begun building the competency case. On paper. "I need 72 hours to review it," she said. Reyes nodded, once with the air of a man who had expected exactly that. "Of course. I'll need your answer by Monday noon." "You'll have it." They shook hands. Reyes and the silent woman left first. Marcus waited until they were through the lobby doors before he turned to her. "It's structured to look complete," he said quietly. "The trust release is real. The estate transfer is real. But the NDA covers anything you might use in a future proceeding. including the evidence about Reyes's own involvement with Cassian pre-filing. If you sign this, you lose the ability to ever bring that forward. I know. They're buying your silence about the Commission's role, not just Cassian's. I know, Marcus. He was quiet for a moment. The meeting with the two capos, it's still set for Sunday. It's still set for Sunday, she confirmed. She picked up her bag and stood and walked out of the Caldwell into the January cold, and the air hit her face like a judgment, and she kept walking. Sunday arrived with freezing rain. The meeting was in a restaurant in Bridgeport that had been closed for renovations for 6 weeks. A useful fiction maintained by a capo named Enzo Mara, one of the two men Vincent had named as carrying debts to her father's memory. The other was a man named Saul Pittman, who ran 3 territories in the Mid-Atlantic and who had the quality of a man who said very little and meant every word of it. Vincent was already inside when she arrived. Mara she recognized. She had met him twice at commission dinners. A wide-shouldered man in his late 60s with a white beard he kept trimmed close, and hands that had done things she did not require the details of. Pittman she had never met in person. He was shorter than she'd imagined, dark-eyed, with the watchful stillness of someone who had spent a career being underestimated and had decided long ago to let people continue. She sat. She placed the folder on the table. Not Marcus's folder, her own. "I appreciate you being here," she said. "Your father introduced me to my wife," Mara said without preamble, 26 years ago, at a dinner in Philadelphia. "I've been waiting to repay that for a long time." He looked at the folder. "Show us what you have." She showed them. It took 40 minutes. She walked them through the financial instruments, the shell company chain, the asset consolidation timeline, and then she showed them the encrypted correspondence, the surveillance footage from her study hallway, the photographs of Celine entering and exiting, and finally the last piece, the phone record and the content reconstruction that placed Dominic Reyes in direct coordination with Cassian Moretti 11 days before she had filed for divorce. 11 days before she had told anyone outside of Marcus that she was planning to file, which meant Cassian had known, which meant someone had told him. Pittman leaned forward when she got to that part. "Where did you get the content reconstruction?" "A forensic communications analyst," she said, "someone Marcus retained. The messages were scrubbed, but the metadata wasn't fully cleaned. Timestamps, routing nodes, the structure of the exchange. The analyst can testify to the methodology." And Reyes's name appears. His routing identifier appears. His name appears in one message that wasn't fully overwritten. She turned the page toward them. "It's there." Pittman looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Mara. Something passed between them that was not a conversation but functioned as one. "If we bring this to the full commission," Mara said slowly, "we're not just talking about Cassian's domestic situation. We're talking about Reyes operating outside his mandate. We're talking about a Don using commission resources to manage a private legal threat to his own position." "Yes," Vivian said. "That's a different category of problem." "Yes," she said again. "That's why I'm here." She drove back to Westfield in the freezing rain with the wipers working hard, and her headlights turning the road into something narrow and uncertain. And she was 40 minutes from the estate when her phone rang through the car speakers, and she answered without looking at the number because Marcus sometimes called from numbers she didn't have stored. It was not Marcus. "Vivienne." The voice was Celine's, but wrong, stripped of the social smoothness, compressed to something she barely recognized. "I need to tell you something. I need you to listen and not hang up." Every nerve in her body went alert. "I'm listening." "They know about Sunday." A pause filled with the sound of Celine breathing too fast. "Cassian knows about the meeting. He knows about Mara and Pittman. He has someone inside. I don't know who. I swear to you, I don't know who, but he had the information this morning and he's already—" Her voice broke slightly, caught itself. "He's already called Reyes. They're moving to reframe the Sunday meeting as you coordinating an insurrection against the Commission's authority. They're going to present it to the full Commission as you attempting to use capos to undermine a Don's legitimate authority structure." The road ahead, the rain, the wipers. "Celine." Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that and frightened of that in equal measure. Why are you telling me this? A long silence. Because what he did to you is what he was eventually going to do to me. The words came out flat, without drama, the flatness of something true. I understand that now. I understood it when I saw Armand's face in that hallway. I was always going to be useful, and then I was going to be a problem to be managed. I was too far in to see it clearly. Another pause. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't, Vivian said, but tell me everything you know. Celine told her in pieces over 43 minutes, while the freezing rain turned to sleet and the road got worse, and Vivian pulled off at a gas station in Shelton and sat in the parking lot with the engine running and listened to the full architecture of what had been built around her. It was worse than she had known. The competency case was not just a pressure tactic. It had been filed with supporting documentation, a psychological assessment conducted by a therapist Vivian had seen for 4 sessions after the miscarriage. A woman named Dr. Carol Ames, who had apparently provided a written evaluation that Celine had helped Cassian's attorneys obtain through means that were, at minimum, a profound violation of professional ethics, and at most, something considerably more criminal. The evaluation characterized Vivian as exhibiting signs of complicated grief disorder, impaired judgment, and a pattern of paranoid ideation. She said I was paranoid, Vivian said when Celine reached that part. Cassian's attorneys have it. It's already been filed as a supporting exhibit. I saw that woman 4 times. I talked to her about losing the baby. Her voice had gone very quiet. I talked to her about losing the baby and I know. Celine's voice was tight with something that might have been shame or might have been fear or might have been both at once. Vivian, I didn't know about the therapist until last week. I want you to know that. I helped with the financial structuring, and I helped build the commission narrative, but I did not know about Dr. Ames. It doesn't sort your involvement into something I can accept right now, Vivian said. I know. What else? The estate, Celine said. There's a lien that was filed against the property 6 days ago. It's buried in the instrument. Cassian's attorneys structured it through a subsidiary holding company that Marcus's people might not have caught yet. If the lien stands, the estate isn't transferable, which means the commission's offer to transfer it to your name was a fiction, Vivian said, a placeholder. They were offering you something they'd already made certain they could pull back. The sleet was loud on the roof of the car. She watched it accumulate on the windshield in the margins where the wipers didn't reach, building up in the corners, slowly narrowing her view. She had been thorough. She had been careful and methodical. And she had spent 6 weeks building something that she had believed was solid. And in the time she had been building it, the people she was building it against had been building something around her, patient, layered, using the grief she had actually experienced and the trust she had actually extended, using the most vulnerable parts of the last 7 months of her life as the material of her own undoing. Dr. Carol Ames. She had talked to that woman about the hospital, about the silence, about lying in a bed at 3 a.m. and reaching for Cassian and feeling the space beside her and not being able to tell whether the emptiness was inside her or around her. She had talked about those things in confidence, in a small office with plants on the windowsill and a box of tissues on the table between them, and that woman had written it down and handed it to Cassian's lawyers, and now it existed in a court filing with the words paranoid ideation attached to her name. Something broke in her chest. Not the thing she'd been holding together, the strategy, the forward motion, the deliberate armor of purpose. Something older than that. The part of her that had walked into that therapist's office genuinely trying to survive her own grief, genuinely believing that asking for help was not a vulnerability that could be turned into a weapon. She sat with it for 30 seconds. Exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus. They have a psychological evaluation, she said when he answered. Dr. Carol Ames, 4 sessions post-miscarriage. It's filed as a supporting exhibit in the competency petition. A pause. How did they get access to... That's the second conversation. First conversation is this. Is there a lien on the estate filed in the last week? Look for a subsidiary holding instrument probably buried in the title chain. She heard him typing, heard him stop. Vivian? How bad? It's there. Filed Thursday. I don't know how we missed. Because you were looking at the right hand, she said, and they were working with the left. She stared through the sleet-covered windshield at the gas station's fluorescent light, which was buzzing at a frequency she could feel behind her eyes. Marcus, I need you to listen carefully because I'm going to tell you something and we are going to have to move very quickly, she breathed. Everything we plan to bring to the commission, the encrypted messages, the asset reconstruction, the Reyes documentation, all of it is now going to be framed as the actions of a mentally unstable woman conducting a paranoid campaign against her husband with the assistance of disloyal capos. They have a therapist's evaluation to anchor that narrative and a court filing to give it structure and Reyes to present it with the commission's implicit endorsement. Then we need to move the commission meeting up, Marcus said, before they can present their version first. There's someone inside, she said. Cassian knew about the Sunday meeting before it happened, which means either Vincent, Mara, or Pittman, or someone in contact with one of them, is feeding information back. The silence on the line was the specific silence of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the board. If there's a leak, Marcus said carefully, then anything we plan from this point forward is already compromised the moment more than two people know it. She looked at her own reflection in the dark of the passenger window. A woman in a parked car in a sleet storm, 37 years old, the daughter of a man who had told her to build relationships because money wasn't the only currency, the wife of a man who had watched her grieve and filed it away for later use. Which means from this point forward, Marcus, you and I are the only two people who know what we're doing next. Not Vincent, not Mara, not Pittman, nobody. Vivian, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Ask. Is there anything else they could have? Anything else you said to anyone in the last year? Any correspondence, any conversation, anything that could be characterized in a way that supports the narrative they're building? She thought about it, went through it carefully, methodically, the way she cataloged everything. And then she stopped. The journal. The leather journal she'd been keeping since the miscarriage, the one her therapist, Dr. Ames, had told her to keep. The one that was in the safe behind the bookcase in her study. The one she had written in 3 weeks ago, before she understood the full scope of what was happening, with a rawness and an honesty she had permitted herself because she believed the safe was secure and the study was hers, and the words were private. The journal Celine had been photographing. She had changed the safe combination in October when she'd first suspected the study had been accessed, but October was after the summer, and the summer was when she had written the worst of it. The entries from the weeks after the hospital, the entries that did not read like a woman who was coping, that read like a woman who was barely surviving, who was writing things down because if she didn't put them somewhere external, they were going to stay inside her and become something she couldn't control. If Celine had photographed those entries, if those entries were now in Cassian's attorney's possession. The fluorescent light above the gas station buzzed and buzzed. Marcus, she said, how quickly can we get before the commission? If I call tonight, request an emergency session on grounds of Dawn misconduct, which is a legitimate procedural right under commission bylaws, they'd have to convene within 5 business days. Do it tonight, right now, after we hang up. She turned the key in the ignition. And Marcus, when you make that call, do not use your office phone. Do not use your cell. Buy a prepaid and use that. You think they're monitoring? I think they've been 3 steps ahead of me since October, and I am done giving them the courtesy of assuming they're not. She put the car in reverse. One more thing. Dr. Carol Ames, I want to know who referred me to her. A pause. Who referred you? After the miscarriage, the hospital gave me a list of grief counselors. I chose Ames because she was 3rd on the list, and her office was 20 minutes from the estate, and her website said she specialized in pregnancy loss. She pulled out of the parking lot onto the empty, sleet-slicked road. But I want to know if that list was curated. I want to know if she was placed on it. I want to know if the referral was... She stopped, because she already knew. She could feel herself knowing it the way you feel a bone give before the pain registers. The structural understanding arriving ahead of the sensation. Celine had been the one to call the hospital on Vivian's behalf. in the first days after. Celine had been the one who handled logistics, who made calls and sent emails and managed the administrative machinery of Vivian's life while Vivian lay in a room and tried to breathe. Celine had told her about the grief counselor list, had mentioned Ames specifically, had said she has wonderful reviews, a colleague recommended her, and Vivian had been in no condition to ask which colleague or why this particular name. The road stretched out ahead of her, dark and wet and narrow between the trees. She had walked into that therapist's office on Celine's recommendation. She had sat across from a woman Celine had selected, and she had opened herself completely, every broken, grief-ruined 3 a.m. part of herself. And she had believed she was being held in confidence. The betrayal moved through her like something physical, like the cold, like the sleet. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a gray and total thing that got into every part of her and stayed. She drove for 2 miles without speaking. "Marcus," she said finally, "get me in front of the commission before they do. I'll make the call in the next 10 minutes. And Marcus." Her hands on the wheel were very still. Whatever version of me they're planning to present to that room, the unstable woman, the paranoid wife, the grief case who couldn't hold herself together, I need every document I have to be in that room first, before they say a single word about who I am. Do you understand? I understand. Because I'm not going to sit in front of those men and be described in the language of my own grief without having already shown them what I am capable of. She ended the call. The estate gate opened as she approached. The oak trees were black shapes in the headlights, sleet-covered, enormous, rooted so deep in that ground they had long since stopped being separate from it. She had placed every one of them. She knew where each one stood. She parked the car and sat for a moment before going in, because the thing she had not said to Marcus and would not say to Marcus was this. She was frightened. Not of Cassian, not of Reyes, not of the commission or the competency petition or the lien on the estate. She was frightened of the journal, of what it contained, of sitting in a room full of powerful and dangerous men while someone read aloud from the worst nights of her life and asked the room to draw a conclusion. She had survived the hospital. She had survived the silence. She had survived 7 months of a marriage that had been slowly dismantling her while she grieved and tried to put herself back together. She was going to have to survive this too, and she was going to have to do it in public, in front of people who had no loyalty to her pain and every reason to find it inconvenient, and she was going to have to do it without flinching. She got out of the car. Inside, the house was quiet. Upstairs, no sound. Cassian was not home. His car was not in the drive, which meant he was in the city, which meant he was with his attorneys, or with Reyes, or with whatever machinery was currently being pointed in her direction. She went to the library. She unlocked the safe. She took out everything that was in it, every document, every drive, every photograph, every printed transcript, and she spread it all across the desk under the brightest light in the room, and she sat down, and she began to look for the thing she had missed, because there was something she had missed. She understood that now. There had been a move made that she hadn't seen, a piece of the architecture she hadn't identified, and it had been there the whole time inside what she thought was her own preparation, and she was going to find it before Monday morning if she had to sit at this desk until the sleet stopped and the sun came up and burned away every shadow in this room. She pulled the first folder toward her. She began. She found it at 2:47 in the morning. It was not in the financial documents. It was not in the encrypted correspondence or the surveillance logs or the shell company chain she had mapped across 3 sheets of paper taped together on the desk. It was in the competency petition itself, in the supporting exhibits, in the footnotes of the psychological assessment, in a single citation she had read 3 times without understanding what she was looking at because she had been reading it as a legal document rather than as a message. Dr. Carol Ames had cited, as part of her clinical foundation, a series of conversations she described as collateral interviews with parties close to the subject. Standard practice in certain kinds of evaluations. Vivian had read it and moved past it because collateral interviews were procedurally unremarkable, but the collateral interviews had been conducted in September. Vivian had seen Dr. Ames for the last time in August, which meant the collateral interviews, the conversations with parties close to the subject that had shaped the evaluation's conclusions, had happened after Vivian stopped seeing the therapist, had happened without Vivian's knowledge or consent, had happened in a window that, when she cross-referenced it against the encrypted correspondence timeline, sat directly between Cassian's first call to Reyes and the construction of the competency petition framework. The collateral interviews were the foundation. Whatever had been said in them by whoever had sat across from Dr. Ames and described Vivian in the language that ended up in that evaluation, that was the load-bearing wall of the entire case against her. She needed to know who had been in those interviews. She picked up her phone. It was 2:47 in the morning, and she called Marcus, and he answered in 2 rings because Marcus had apparently also not slept. "The collateral interviews in the Ames evaluation," she said. "September. After I stopped seeing her. I need the names of whoever she spoke to. Those would be protected under—" "I know what they're protected under. I need you to file a motion to compel disclosure on grounds that the evaluation is being used as legal evidence in a proceeding, and the subjects of that evidence have a right to confront the basis of claims made against them. File it first thing Monday. I need those names before the commission session." "Vivian, the commission session is Wednesday." Marcus's voice had the compressed quality of a man managing 17 things at once at 3 in the morning. "If I file Monday and they contest, then we go in Wednesday without the names, and we argue the evaluation should be excluded on procedural grounds because the collateral interview subjects are unidentified." She pressed 2 fingers to the space between her eyebrows. "Either way, I want the motion filed. Make them respond to something." "All right. One more thing." She looked at the papers spread across the desk. The whole map of it, everything she had built and everything that had been built against her, layered on top of each other like 2 cities occupying the same coordinates. "The thing I missed, the piece I couldn't find." She stopped. "Tell me." "It's the journal. I know it's the journal, but it's not just that Celine photographed it. It's that they've had it long enough to have it analyzed, professionally analyzed, the way you'd analyze a document for a legal proceeding. Which means somewhere there is an expert who read my private journals and produced an opinion about what they mean, and that opinion is going to be in that commission room whether I bring it there or not." She breathed. "I need someone who can counter that. A forensic psychologist who can look at the same material and produce a different framework." Silence. "That's a 48-hour turnaround," Marcus said. "Then start in the next 10 minutes. She ended the call. She sat in the library with the sleet finally gone quiet outside and the house completely still, and the documents spread around her like the territory of a war she had been fighting longer than she'd known she was in it. And she thought about Wednesday, and she thought about the room, and she thought about what it was going to take to walk into it and hold it. Then she straightened the papers and went to make coffee, because there was no version of this that got easier if she sat still. Monday arrived gray and hard. Marcus filed 4 motions before noon: the compelled disclosure on the collateral interviews, a challenge to the lien instrument on procedural grounds, a formal objection to the competency petition's admissibility as a prejudicial filing in an ongoing civil proceeding, and a 5th document that was not a motion but a notification, a letter to the Commission's administrative body filed through the correct procedural channel, formally requesting an emergency session under Article 9 of the Commission's governing bylaws, citing evidence of Adon's misuse of Commission resources and infrastructure for personal legal advantage. Article 9 was not invoked often. In the last 30 years it had been used 4 times. Each time the Don in question had not emerged from the session in the same position he had entered it. Cassian's attorneys responded to the Article 9 notification at 3 in the afternoon with a counterfiling that characterized the request as procedurally improper and the underlying claims as fabricated by a party acting in bad faith. It was a standard response, the legal equivalent of covering ground rather than holding it, and Marcus called to tell her this, and she could hear in his voice that he thought they were marginally ahead. She did not feel ahead. She felt like a woman standing in the middle of a road, watching 2 vehicles approaching from opposite directions and calculating which one to step toward. Vincent Rua called at 4. She let it go to voicemail, then listened. "Mrs. Moretti, I've been made aware of some concerns about the Sunday meeting. I want you to know that whatever you've heard, my loyalty has not changed. I'd like to speak with you directly. Please call me back." She did not call him back. She did not know if Vincent was the leak. She did not know if Mara was the leak, or Pittman, or someone adjacent to all three of them. What she knew was that she had told Marcus she was operating with a closed circle, and she had meant it, and the part of her that wanted to believe Vincent, that wanted the version of this where his 31 years of careful loyalty to her father's memory were real and the loyalty had passed to her. That part was going to have to wait until Wednesday to find out. Trust was a thing she would recalibrate when she had the time. Right now, it was a liability, ça. Tuesday she spent with the forensic psychologist Marcus had located, a woman named Dr. Irene Vasquez, 60 years old, who had spent 22 years providing expert testimony in cases involving coercive control, financial manipulation, and the weaponization of mental health documentation in domestic legal disputes. She was small and precise, and she read the Ames evaluation the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, without expression, turning pages at an even rate, occasionally making a notation in the margin with a mechanical pencil. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Vivian across the conference table. This evaluation has 3 significant methodological problems, she said. The collateral interviews are undisclosed and therefore unverifiable. The diagnostic language used exceeds what 4 sessions of grief counseling could clinically support. And the framing throughout conflates appropriate trauma response with pathological instability in a way that reflects the evaluator's conclusion rather than her clinical findings. She tapped the cover page once. In plain language, she started with the conclusion she was paid to reach and worked backward. "Can you say that in a commission room?" Vivian said. Dr. Vasquez looked at her with the steady attention of a woman who had said hard things in difficult rooms for 2 decades. "I can say it anywhere." "Wednesday," Vivian said. "Can you be there Wednesday?" "I'll be there." Chitamos. Wednesday morning. She dressed in the guest room, the room she had moved into quietly, weeks ago, as a precaution she had told herself was practical. Navy. Simple. The pearl earrings her mother had left her, small and specific and carrying the particular weight of inherited things. She stood at the window for a moment before going downstairs. The oak trees were still. The frozen lawn was pale in the early light. It was 6:40, and she had not slept more than 3 hours, and her eyes felt scraped clean, and her hands, she looked at her hands, were not shaking. She went downstairs. Cassian was in the kitchen. She had not seen him since Thursday's dinner. He had been at the city apartment, and she had not sought contact, and their attorneys had conducted all communication through the appropriate channels. He was standing at the espresso machine in the clothes of a man who had also not slept, jacket on, tie not yet tied, and he turned when she walked in and they looked at each other across the kitchen island where she had stood 6 weeks ago, with her coffee and her invoices, and the first day she had decided to stop pretending. He looked older than he had on Thursday, or perhaps the same age, and she was only now seeing it clearly. "You don't have to do this today," he said. "Yes, I do." "Vivian," he set his cup down, "whatever happens in that room today, it becomes something that can't be undone. I need you to understand that." "I understand it." She moved to the cabinet and took down a glass and filled it with water and drank half of it. "I've understood it since the night you forgot to end a phone call." A long silence. The espresso machine clicked and went quiet. "I did love you," he said. The past tense sat in the room like something fallen. She set the glass down carefully. "I know you did. I think you might still. I think that's the part of this that you haven't figured out how to manage. That it's possible to love someone and still do every single thing you did." She looked at him directly. "That's your problem to carry, Cassian. I'm done carrying things that belong to you." She picked up her bag and walked out of the kitchen, and she did not look back, and the front door closed behind her with the same quietness she had heard from Armand Voss 6 nights ago, and she thought, yes, like that. Exactly like that. The commission convened at 10 o'clock in a building in Lower Manhattan that appeared from the outside to be a private members club of the kind that still existed in certain parts of the city. Unremarkable facade, no signage, a door that opened only to specific people. Inside, the room was long and dark paneled, and the table could seat 20, though today it seated 11, 7 commission heads or their designated representatives, Reyes in his capacity as administrative mediator, and 3 observers whose presence was procedural. Vivian sat on one side of the table with Marcus and Dr. Vasquez. Cassian sat on the other side with two attorneys she didn't know, and one she did. A man named Garrett Fliss, who was 65 and had the reptilian stillness of a lawyer who had never in his career been surprised by anything a human being was capable of doing to another human being. Reyes sat at the head of the table. Old Ferraro was present, which she had not expected, seated 2 positions down from Reyes with his hands folded and his face arranged into the specific blankness of a man who had decided to observe before deciding. Pittman was there. Mara was not. She filed that away. Reyes called the session to order at 10:04. He summarized the procedural basis, the Article 9 request, the counterfiling, the pending motions, in the flat, efficient language of a man reading a weather report. Then he turned to Cassian's side and said, "Mr. Fliss, the commission will hear from you first." Fliss stood. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't use notes because using notes implied uncertainty, and he moved through the opening of his presentation with the smooth, unhurried authority of a man who believed he had already won and was simply performing the formality of proving it. He presented the competency petition first. Dr. Ames's evaluation summarized. The language of complicated grief disorder, impaired judgment, paranoid ideation delivered in a tone that was not unkind, that was in fact carefully sympathetic. The tone of a man who felt genuinely sorry that a woman in distress had been permitted to take legal actions that were not in her interest or anyone else's. He presented the Article 9 request as an act of desperation. A woman with compromised judgment, advised by lawyers with an interest in prolonged litigation, using a procedural mechanism designed for genuine misconduct to wage a personal domestic battle in a form that was not designed for it. He presented Vivian's outreach to Mara and Pittman as an attempted manipulation of commission members, a serious breach of protocol that reflected either profound naivety about how the commission functioned or a deliberate attempt to fracture its unity. He spoke for 22 minutes. He was very good. She sat and listened to every word and breathed at an even rate and did not move and did not look at Cassian and did not allow a single thing Garrett Fliss said to show on her face. When he sat down, Reyes looked at Marcus. "Counselor." Marcus stood. He did not have Fliss's performance quality. He had something better, the quality of a man who was about to show his hand and knew with complete certainty what was in it. "The commission has been presented with a narrative," Marcus said. "A narrative about a grieving woman who lost stability following a trauma and has been making decisions that exceed her judgment. I'm going to show you a different narrative. Not a counterargument, evidence. Documented, verified, time-stamped evidence. And I'm going to ask the commission to decide, when we're done, which narrative the evidence supports." He opened the first folder. He started with the financial instruments, the shell company chain, the asset consolidation timeline, the progressive entanglement of Vivian's family trust with syndicate holdings. He was precise and specific, and he did not editorialize. He let the documents speak, and he explained what they said, and he moved to the next document. He went for 31 minutes before he reached the Reyes material. When he got there, the room changed. She felt it. Not saw it, felt it, the way pressure changes in a room when a door opens somewhere else in the building. The commission heads had been listening with the cultivated neutrality of men who had heard many presentations across many tables. But when Marcus placed the routing metadata on the table and explained in plain language what it demonstrated about the coordination between Cassian Moretti and Dominic Reyes in the 11 days before the divorce filing, she saw Ferraro's hands, which had been folded on the table, separate. Reyes himself did not move. His face did not change. But something in the air around him changed, and she watched him understand that whatever he had believed was controlled was no longer entirely in his control. "The commission is being asked," Marcus said, "to validate a proceeding that was built using commission resources, specifically the services of its own mediator, as a tool in a private legal dispute." Mr. Reyes was engaged by Don Moretti 11 days before the filing, before any commission procedure had been initiated, to assist in constructing the response to a divorce action that Mr. Moretti anticipated. That is a misuse of commission infrastructure for personal gain. Under Article 9, that is exactly the kind of conduct this body was designed to address. He sat down. The room held its silence for a beat that lasted longer than it should have. Then Fliss was up again, fast, controlled. The metadata presented is the product of a forensic reconstruction of dubious methodology. The interpretation applied to it is speculative at best and fabricated at Mr. Fliss, Ferraro's voice. Quiet, with the specific quietness of a man who did not need volume to fill a room. Sit down. Fliss sat. Ferraro looked at Reyes, just looked at him. The look lasted 4 seconds and contained more communication than the last hour of legal presentation. Reyes said, "Perhaps a brief recess." "No," Pittman's voice from the far end of the table. First word he'd spoken since the session began. "I'd like to hear from Mrs. Moretti directly." Every head turned toward her. She had known this might happen. She had prepared for it and dreaded it in equal measure. She looked at Marcus, who gave her the smallest nod. "Your call." And she looked at Pittman, who was watching her with those dark, still eyes, and she thought about the guest room and the pearl earrings and the oak trees in the pale morning light. She stood. "Mr. Pittman, thank you." She looked at the table shot, not at Cassian, not at Reyes, at the table itself, the dark wood of it, the surface all of this was being conducted across. "I want to say one thing before I respond to anything. I spent 4 sessions with a therapist in the worst months of my life trying to survive the loss of a child. What I said in that room was said in confidence to a professional, in the belief that I was in a protected space. The use of that material in this proceeding, the conversion of my grief into a legal weapon, is the clearest illustration I can offer of the kind of man we're discussing and the kind of operations he's been running." She looked up, around the table. "I didn't come here today to ask this commission to take my side. I came here to show you what was done with yours." She reached into the folder Marcus slid toward her and placed the last document on the table. It was simple. 1 page. A communication reconstructed from metadata between Cassian Moretti and Dominic Reyes, dated 11 days before the filing, in which the specific language used to describe Vivienne, emotionally compromised, paranoid presentation, grief disordered, recommend psychological assessment for legal purposes, appeared verbatim. The same language, the same phrases, the phrases that appeared 6 weeks later in Dr. Carol Ames's evaluation. The evaluation had not described Vivienne. The evaluation had repeated in clinical language what Cassian had told Reyes to have said about her. "The commission's mediator drafted the diagnosis," she said. "The therapist filled it in. My husband signed off on it. And then they used it to tell you that I was too unstable to be believed." She picked up the page and set it back down. "I'll let you decide what that means for whose judgment you trust in this room." She sat. The silence was total. Cassian was looking at her. She could feel it without turning, the specific weight of his attention, which she had spent 11 years being able to locate in any room without looking. She did not look at him. She looked at Ferraro, who was looking at the document she had placed on the table, and she watched him read it, and she watched his face when he finished. He looked at Reyes. Reyes said, "The document's authenticity is Dominic." Ferraro's voice had dropped to something that was barely above conversational, which meant it was more dangerous than anything he'd said before. "Be very careful right now about what you say next." Reyes closed his mouth. The room breathed. Fliss leaned toward Cassian and said something in a low, rapid voice. Cassian did not respond. He was still looking at Vivienne. She could still feel it, the weight of it, and she understood that he had just watched the room turn and was calculating what came next, was running the numbers with the speed and precision that had built an empire. And she understood also that the numbers were not coming out in his favor. She had one more thing. She had saved it, had debated in the 3 a.m. stillness of the library whether to use it or hold it, whether it was necessary or whether what she'd already presented was sufficient, whether deploying it changed the nature of what she was doing in a way she could justify. She had decided it was necessary. She had decided this because necessary was the operative standard, not comfortable. "There's one additional piece," she said. Marcus slid her the second folder. She opened it. "In October," she said, "I installed a camera in the hallway outside my private study. I did this because I had noticed signs that the study had been accessed without my knowledge. The camera recorded 22 instances of entry over a 6-week period. 14 of those instances were Celine Voss. She turned the first photograph toward the table. These are time-stamped stills. The dates correspond with specific documents that subsequently appeared in the competency petition and in the financial counterfiling. She turned the second photograph. This one is from the night of November 17th. You can see Ms. Voss removing a document from the study and photographing it with her phone. She set the photographs flat on the table. Ms. Voss is a forensic accountant. She structured significant portions of the Moretti Syndicate's legitimate holdings. She had access to this house because I trusted her. She used that access to photograph my private journals, my financial documents, and the working notes of my attorney, which she had no right to and no warrant for. She paused. I want the Commission to understand that this is not a domestic dispute. This is a coordinated operation that used the Commission's own mediator, a licensed therapist, and a forensic specialist with criminal organization ties to build a legal case designed to strip me of my family's assets and my legal standing. If the Commission permits that to stand, then every wife at every table in this room is standing on the same ground I was standing on, believing she has rights that can't be taken from her, not understanding that the infrastructure around her can be turned against her at any moment with the Commission's implicit blessing. She closed the folder. The room was completely still. Ferraro said, I'd like to call a break. Reyes said, I think that wasn't a request, Ferraro said. The break lasted 40 minutes. She sat in an anteroom with Marcus and Dr. Vasquez and drank water and did not speak and listened to her own heartbeat, which was fast and uneven in a way she was choosing to ignore. Marcus was on his phone reading something. Dr. Vasquez sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the wall with the expression of a woman who had been in difficult rooms many times and knew how to exist in the waiting. The photographs? Marcus said without looking up from his phone. The November 17th still. That's what turned it. I know. They could see her face. It wasn't ambiguous. He set the phone down. Fliss is going to try to negotiate. In the next session, he's going to propose a settlement that gives you more than Reyes's original offer. I know. Vivian. He looked at her directly. You've won the room. What happens next depends on what you want to walk out with. She thought about that. She looked at the plain wall of the anteroom and the water glass in her hand, and she thought about what she wanted to walk out with, which was a question she had been answering and re-answering for 6 weeks, and which had changed its shape each time she thought she'd found the final form of it. Everything that's mine, she said. Not a negotiated version. Not a settlement that looks generous and has a lien buried in it. Every Ashcroft asset, unencumbered, returned in full. The estate. The trust. The cash that was moved through the shell structures that originated from my family's capital. I want an accounting, and I want it returned. She set the water glass down. And I want the competency petition withdrawn with prejudice and a formal notation in the commission record that it was filed in bad faith using fabricated clinical documentation. Marcus was quiet. That last part, he said, that's the part they're going to push back on hardest. Because a formal notation means it's on record that Dominic Reyes helped build a false psychological case against Adon's wife using commission resources. Yes. She met his eyes. That's why I want it. In the room beyond the anteroom door, she could hear the low sound of voices. The commission in consultation, the sound of power redistributing itself, the sound of men who had built careers on reading situations, deciding how this one resolved. Cassian was in there. She had not looked at him since she'd sat down after her statement. She had not needed to. She had spent 11 years reading every version of him, every calculated silence, every controlled expression, every moment when the architecture of who he was publicly had briefly given way to reveal something human underneath. And she understood, with the particular clarity that came from the far side of a thing, that she was done reading him. She had learned everything he had to teach her, and it had cost her more than she had known she was spending. And what she wanted now was to be in a room that didn't contain the weight of that education. The door opened. Reyes stood in the frame. His mild, unremarkable face had the look of a man who had spent 40 minutes being talked to in a way he had not expected and had decided, in the particular transactional manner of a man who dealt exclusively in outcomes, to adjust. The commission is ready to reconvene, he said. I think we're going to find a resolution that works for everyone. She stood. Marcus stood beside her. She walked back into the room and she sat down and she looked at Ferraro, who looked back at her with the eyes of a man who had seen a great many things in a great many rooms and had, in the last 40 minutes, added this to the list, and she waited for the commission to speak. Fliss was already leaning forward, preparing the opening of something, and she thought, say whatever you need to say because I've been in this room before. I've been in every version of this room, and I know what I'm walking out with. And there is nothing on this table that changes that. Her hands were flat on the dark wood. Steady, completely steady. Outside, 30 floors below, the city moved in its ordinary way. Taxis and construction and people who knew nothing about the room she was sitting in, going about the business of lives that did not intersect with this particular table in this particular building where the architecture of her last 11 years was being formally dismantled. She breathed in. Fliss opened his mouth. And Vivian Moretti, who had sat beside the most dangerous man in America while he built an empire, who had buried a child and survived a marriage that had been slowly becoming a trap, who had spent 6 weeks in the dark cataloging every piece of evidence with hands that did not shake. Vivian looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had already decided the outcome of this room and waited for everyone else to catch up. Garrett Fliss spoke for 11 minutes. She counted. Not the seconds, the quality of the minutes. The way each one carried a different weight as he moved through what was, she understood immediately, not an argument but a surrender dressed in the language of negotiation. He proposed full restoration of the Ashcroft Trust assets. He proposed the estate transfer, unencumbered, the lien instrument dissolved with immediate effect. He proposed a cash settlement he described as reflective of the Commission's recognition of the situation's complexity, which was a way of saying it was large enough to communicate that the Commission understood what it owed her for what had been done in its name. He did not propose the formal notation in the Commission record. When he finished, Marcus stood. The notation, Marcus said. Simply. Those 2 words and nothing else. Fliss looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at Ferraro. Ferraro was looking at a point somewhere above the table. Not at the ceiling, not at anyone present, at the specific middle distance of a man making a final decision about the cost of a thing. A private notation, Reyes said, entered into the internal record, not public-facing. Entered into the record, Marcus said. Accessible to any commission member upon request. Another silence. Ferraro said, agreed. Fliss did not look at Cassian when he said, the Dawn consents to the notation on the understanding that it pertains to procedural conduct and not to— The notation will say what it says, Ferraro said. That's the end of that sentence. Fliss closed his folder. The session was adjourned at 1:17 in the afternoon. Vivian sat at the table while the room emptied around her. Commission heads filing out in ones and twos, the low sound of conversation resuming in the hallway, the shuffle of papers and chairs, and the particular collective exhale of a room releasing tension it had been holding for 3 hours. Marcus had his hand on her shoulder briefly. Not a squeeze, just contact. The acknowledgement of a man who understood that what had just happened in this room was not something you celebrated immediately in the way you celebrated ordinary victories. Because it was not an ordinary victory, and it had not been cheap. Cassian was the last one standing on his side of the table. His attorneys had gathered their materials and gone ahead. Reyes had left without looking at her. The room was nearly empty, and Cassian stood with his jacket buttoned and his hands at his sides, and looked at her across the dark wood of the table with the expression she had seen on his face exactly once before. At the hospital, in the corridor, after. And it had the same quality now that it had then, the quality of a man confronting a loss that his particular architecture had no framework for processing. She met his eyes. She held them. She did not say anything, and neither did he, and after a moment that lasted long enough to contain everything they were not going to say to each other in this room or any room, he turned and walked out. The door closed. She sat alone at the commission table in the quiet of the empty room and pressed both palms flat against the dark wood and breathed. 3 counts in, hold for 4, release for 7. And let the shaking come, finally, because there was no one left to see it, and it had been waiting a long time. It lasted 40 seconds. Then it was done. She stood, gathered her folder, and walked out into the January light. The papers were finalized over the following 3 weeks. It was not clean or simple. Nothing involving this much money and this many overlapping legal instruments ever was. But it moved with the momentum of a commission that wanted the matter closed and a legal team on Cassian's side that had run out of productive places to push. Marcus worked 18-hour days and called her every evening, with updates delivered in the measured, comprehensive way of a man who understood that the person on the other end of the line needed information, not reassurance. The Ashcroft Trust was restored in full on the 14th day. She sat at the desk in the library when Marcus called to confirm it and held the phone against her ear and looked out the window at the oak trees and felt something that was not triumph. Triumph was too clean, too singular, but something quieter and more lasting, the feeling of weight redistributed after too long in one position. The lien was dissolved on the 17th day. The estate transferred on the 21st. The cash settlement arrived in a private account on the 23rd, and she looked at the number on the screen and then closed the laptop because the number was not the point and never had been. The competency petition was withdrawn with prejudice on the 24th, with the formal notation entered into the commission record as agreed. The petition filed in the matter of Moretti versus Moretti contained supporting documentation produced in coordination with commission administrative personnel acting outside their designated mandate, and is hereby stricken in its entirety with no prejudice to the respondent's legal standing or character. It was dry, bureaucratic language. It said everything she had needed it to say. Dr. Carol Ames surrendered her license before the state board could convene a hearing. Vivian did not seek further action against her. She had what she needed, which was the record, and the record was enough. Celine did not call again after the commission session. Vivian heard, through a peripheral contact she didn't seek out but didn't avoid, that Celine had left the state, had taken a position with an accounting firm in Seattle, which was far enough to be a choice rather than a commute. Armand had finalized his own legal separation from the engagement with the speed of a man who wanted distance from everything the situation had touched, which she understood and did not blame him for. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in February. She was not present. Marcus was present, which was legally sufficient. She was in the library when he called. "It's done," he said. "Thank you," she said. Marcus, genuinely, "Thank you." "You did the work," he said. "I carried the folders." She laughed briefly, which surprised her. The sound of it in the quiet room, unexpected and real. After she hung up, she sat for a long time in the reading chair she had reupholstered twice. In the library she had built around herself in the first years of a marriage she had believed in completely, and she thought about what it meant for a thing to be done. There was supposed to be a feeling that accompanied that word. Done. A resolution. A closing of something that had been open. She had been expecting it, and it had not arrived. What arrived instead was something more like clarity. A view of the landscape without the weather that had been obscuring it. The bare facts of where she stood, and what was around her, and what direction she might move in now that the movement was entirely her own, to choose. She chose that afternoon to take a walk. She put on her coat and her boots, and she went out the front door and down the drive and along the eastern approach, past the oak trees she had placed one by one, through the gate that opened at her approach, and out onto the road that ran along the edge of the property. The February air was cold and clean. Her breath came in slow plumes. The ground was hard under her boots, and the sky was the specific pale blue of late winter, the kind that didn't promise warmth but had a clarity that summer skies never achieved. She walked for 40 minutes without a destination and returned to the house and stood in the kitchen and made herself lunch, eggs, toast, coffee, and ate standing at the counter looking out the window at the frozen garden. And it was the most ordinary thing she had done in months, and it felt, in its ordinariness, like something she had won back. Spring came slowly that year. March brought thaw, and then more frost, and then thaw again, the ground unable to commit to one state, which felt apt in a way she didn't spend much time examining. She began sleeping in the main bedroom again, not as a statement, simply because the guest room faced east, and the morning light woke her at 5 and she was not ready to be woken at 5. The main bedroom faced north, and the light was later and grayer, and she slept better and woke with more of herself intact. She had been seeing a new therapist since February. A man named Dr. Harlan Webb who worked out of an office in New Haven that had no plants and no tissue box on the table, just two chairs and a window, and a man who had spent 35 years listening to people and had the quality of someone for whom listening had become a physical practice, something he did with his whole body, leaned forward slightly, hands loose, eyes present. In their third session, she told him about Dr. Ames. She told it plainly, without the editorial distance she had maintained in the commission room, not as evidence but as experience, as the thing that had happened to her, the specific violation of it, the way it felt to understand that the space she had believed was protected had been compromised from the beginning. Harlan Webb listened. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do with that?" "I've already done it," she said. "Legally. I mean, with the feeling of it." She thought about it. "I want it to stop defining what I'll allow myself to say out loud." He nodded. "Then let's start there." They started there. She went every Tuesday. She did not tell many people about it, not because she was ashamed, but because it was hers. In the specific way, she was reclaiming things as hers. The library, the kitchen in the morning, the walk along the Eastern Drive, Tuesday afternoons in New Haven with a man who listened properly. Whoa. In April, she hired an attorney, not Marcus, who remained her general counsel, but a specialist in nonprofit governance, and began the structural work of building the organization she had been thinking about since the night she'd sat in the library, mapping everything that had been done to her, and understanding, with the clarity of someone inside a system looking at its machinery, how many other women were inside systems they didn't yet understand and had no map for. She called it the Ashcroft Foundation. Her mother's name. Her grandfather's money, returned to her and deployed as she chose. The foundation's stated purpose was support and legal advocacy for individuals, primarily women, navigating situations of coercive control, financial abuse, and the weaponization of legal and psychological systems against them. She funded it with the cash settlement in its entirety, which made Marcus briefly speechless on the phone, and then she funded it further from the trust's yield, which made him silent for a longer period. "You're giving away the settlement," he said finally. "I'm using it," she said. "There's a distinction there that I understand, but that I want you to understand I understand." "I understand that you understand it," she said, and that was somehow enough. She hired a director in May, a woman named Rosa Kwan, who had spent 12 years running legal advocacy programs, and who came to the interview with a prepared document that was so thorough Vivian had to stop herself from telling her she was hired before she finished presenting it. She hired a staff of 4 and contracted with 3 law firms in different states who agreed to provide services on a sliding scale to foundation clients. And she spent 3 months in meetings and phone calls and document reviews establishing something that would exist independently of her, that would run without requiring her presence to sustain it, that would be a thing in the world rather than a project she was personally carrying. By the time summer arrived, the foundation had taken its first 12 cases. She did not publicize what it was built on. She did not need to. Rosa handled the communications with a clarity and directness that Vivian appreciated, and what people needed to know was what the foundation did, not the specific history of why. She was not anonymous. Her name was on the charter. Her connection to the Ashcroft Trust was a matter of public record. But she was not the story, and that distinction felt important in a way she couldn't fully articulate and didn't try to. Vincent Rua came to the estate in June. She had been expecting him, in the sense that she had known, since February, that this conversation existed somewhere in the future, and that she would have to have it. He called first, and she told him to come on a Saturday, which gave her the specific time and the specific setting and the knowledge that she had chosen both. He sat across from her in the drawing room with his hands on his knees and his white beard trimmed close and the particular quality of a man who had arrived prepared to account for himself. "I wasn't the leak," he said, before she could speak. "I know," she said. He looked at her steadily. "How long have you known?" "Since March, when I had the communications forensics reviewed more thoroughly. The timing of the information Cassian received, it wasn't consistent with what I'd shared with you. It was consistent with what I'd shared with Mara." Vincent was quiet. Enzo. She folded her hands. "He's been with Cassian since before I was in this family. I should have seen it." You couldn't have known. I should have assumed. She looked at the window. The summer garden, green and overgrown in a way she found she preferred to the severe tidiness the estate management company had maintained when Cassian was overseeing its upkeep. I got sloppy about trust. I understood that I needed to limit who I shared information with, and then I made an exception because I needed allies, and I wanted them to be the right ones, and I wanted to believe that your father's debts were what they were. My debt to your father is real, Vincent said, whatever Enzo did. I believe you. She met his eyes. I believed you then. I still believe you now. I'm not angry at you, Vincent. I'm telling you what happened, so the account is accurate between us. He looked at her for a moment with the eyes of a man recalibrating something. You've changed, he said. Yes. You're harder. Not in a way that's bad, in a way that's... He stopped. Your father got hard the same way. After your mother died, something settled into him that had been loose before. She didn't say anything for a moment. The summer light moved through the window slowly. What happened to Mara? She said. The commission handled it. The way Vincent said handled carried its particular weight, the weight of 31 years of understanding what that word meant in this context. He won't be making reports to anyone going forward. She nodded. She did not ask for specifics. The world she had been adjacent to for 11 years had its own accounting systems, and she had made a decision, in February, about how much of that world she intended to remain in proximity to. The answer was, as little as the facts of her life allowed, and the facts of her life were changing. I'm stepping back, she said, from this, from the commission, from the families, from the geography of all of it. The foundation is legitimate work, above board, and I intend to keep it that way. You're leaving. I'm choosing, she said. That's different. Vincent looked at his hands, then he looked up. If you ever need something moved carefully, he said, which was what he had said to her at that dinner 8 months ago, the original offer, the careful, lateral communication of a man who had been in this world long enough to know that offers had to be made sideways. I know, she said. Thank you, Vincent. He left at noon. She watched the car go down the eastern drive between the oak trees and turn onto the road, and she stood in the drawing room doorway for a moment after it was gone. And then she went to find Rosa Kwan's email about the Foundation's third-quarter caseload and responded to 3 items she had been sitting on for a week, and that was the shape of the afternoon. Cassian came in September. She had not expected this one. Or perhaps she had, in the way you expect certain things, because they have the specific gravity of inevitability, because they are the kind of thing that has to happen before the story can be fully over, and the story had not yet been fully over. He called from the gate, and she let him in because the alternative was a conversation conducted through an intercom system at the end of a driveway, and she was not going to do that. He looked the way she had thought he might look. Not diminished exactly, because Cassian Moretti was not the kind of man who diminished, but altered, in the way of something that has been through significant pressure and emerged with a different distribution of itself. The silver at his temples had spread. The set of his shoulders was different, not less commanding, but less defended, as though he had decided somewhere in the last several months that the effort of that particular defense was not returning sufficient value. He stood in the doorway of the drawing room and looked at the room, and the room looked back. The chairs she had chosen, the lamps, the painting above the fireplace she had bought at auction in Boston, on a trip she had taken alone because Cassian had been in the city and she had not wanted to wait. You changed the furniture, he said. Some of it. It looks good. Thank you. He sat, which she had not entirely expected. She sat across from him, in the same chair she and Vincent had occupied in June, with the same summer into autumn light coming through the window and a cup of coffee she had made because the habit of offering it was older than the anger and apparently had outlasted it. I'm not going to ask you to take me back, he said. Good. I'm not here to... I don't have a request. He held the coffee cup in both hands. I've been trying to figure out what I'm here for, and the honest answer is I'm not entirely certain. I wanted to see how you were. I'm well, she said, better than well. He looked at her. I know, I hear things. The foundation. The foundation. Something moved through his expression. Not pride, which would have been wrong and she would have closed the conversation for, but something more complicated, the expression of a man encountering evidence of a person he understood he had underestimated, even after 11 years of daily proximity. What you've built, it's real. Rosa Kwan is very good. She is. A silence. A different kind of silence than any the two of them had occupied across 11 years. Not tense, not managed, not the silence of two people deciding what to perform for each other. Just the silence of a finished thing, of two people sitting in the room where something had been and which was now over. I was wrong, he said. I'm not telling you that to get something from you. I understand that there's nothing I can... I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it said plainly by the person who did it. He looked at his hands. The way I handled the money was wrong. What I allowed Celine to do was wrong. Dr. Ames was... That was the worst of it, that I let that happen. He stopped, breathed. You were trying to survive something real, and I converted it into a legal instrument, and I've thought about that every day since February. She listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She waited until he was finished, and the room had held his words for a moment, and then she said, I believe you. He looked up. I believe you mean it, she said, and I believe you've thought about it every day. And I believe some part of what we had for 11 years was real. I've made my peace with holding those two things at the same time, the real parts and the parts that turned out to be something else. She set her coffee down. But believing you is different from forgiving you in a way that changes anything between us. It doesn't change anything. You're not coming back into my life because you regret what you did. The regret is yours to carry. He was quiet for a long time. I know, he said finally. I know. They sat for another 15 minutes without speaking much. Occasional small things, the neutral facts of continued existence, the kind of conversation that exists at the very end of something when there is no more conflict to drive the words and no future to build them toward. When he stood to leave, he looked around the drawing room one more time with the careful attention of someone committing a room to memory, knowing they will not see it again. At the door he stopped, turned. Vivian. His voice had the quality of a man spending something he understood he had no right to spend. For what it's worth. Walking into that commission room the way you did. I've been in that building for 30 years. I've seen a lot of things happen in that room. He stopped. I've never seen anything like that. She looked at him. I know, she said. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched the car go down the drive, and she breathed slowly in the September air and felt the particular completeness of a thing that has been fully said, not resolved in the way of problems solved and wounds closed, but complete in the way of stories that have reached their actual ending, which is never the dramatic moment, but always the quiet thing that comes after, the ordinary afternoon on the other side. Celine called in October. Vivian was in New Haven, sitting in the parking lot of Harlan Webb's building after a Tuesday session, when her phone showed the number. Seattle area code, which she had added to her contacts in the way you keep certain things visible as a practice of honesty with yourself. She sat with the ringing phone in her hand for 4 rings. Then she answered. Viv. Celine's voice had the quality of a long distance, not just geography, but time, and the specific alteration of a person who has spent several months living with what they know about themselves. Celine, I'm not going to take up a lot of your time. A pause. The sound of Seattle traffic in the background, thin and far away. I wanted to say that what I told you in the car that night was true. I never wanted you hurt. I know it's true, Vivian said. I've always known that. That's the part I've had the hardest time with, Celine said quietly, that it's possible to love someone and still do what you did. The words were familiar in her mouth. She had said them to Cassian. The truth apparently ran in both directions. I know. I've thought about that too. I was in love with him, Celine said. For a long time before, I kept it managed for years. And then it wasn't manageable anymore, and I made the choice I made, and I told myself that you were going to be all right, that you were strong enough, that what I was taking wasn't... She stopped. I told myself a lot of things. We all do, Vivian said. I'm sorry. 2 words, plain and undecorated. I'm sorry for all of it. The money, the study, the Dr. Ames, especially Ames. I didn't know about the evaluation until it was done, and I should have stopped it, and I didn't, and I've thought about that every... I believe you, Vivian said. The same words she had given Cassian. They did not cost her any less the second time, and they were not diminished by repetition. I believe you didn't know about Ames until it was done. I believe the rest of it, too. Are you... Celine's voice caught slightly. Is it... Are you okay? Truly. Vivian looked through the windshield at the New Haven street. A woman walking a dog, a delivery truck idling, the ordinary Thursday afternoon movement of a city doing its business. She thought about the answer and gave the one that was accurate. Yes, she said. Truly. A long pause. I'm glad, Celine said. The two words had the quality of something she had been waiting months to say and was finally being allowed to set down. Take care of yourself, Celine. You too, Viv. She ended the call and sat in the car and looked at the street for a while longer. The dog walker turned the corner and was gone. The delivery truck pulled away. The street returned to its ordinary state, which was people moving through the afternoon with the uncomplicated purposefulness of people who had somewhere to be. She started the car. She had somewhere to be, too. Rosa had scheduled a call at 4 about the Foundation's caseload, and there was a woman in Baltimore whose situation required the kind of attention that could not wait until Monday, and the Eastern Drive would take 40 minutes if she left now, and 50 if she waited. She left now. The last thing she did that autumn, the last thing that belonged to the story rather than simply to the life that followed it, was walk the perimeter of the estate alone, on a Sunday in late October, when the oak trees had gone gold and the light was low and amber, and the ground underfoot was covered in the first serious fall of leaves. She walked the full perimeter. It took an hour and 20 minutes. She knew every foot of it, every slope and flat, every place where the drainage was good, and the one place where it had never been right despite 3 different contractors' attempts. She had walked it in winter and spring, and the previous autumn when the marriage was still technically intact, and she was beginning to understand it wasn't, and she had not yet decided what to do with that understanding. She walked it now as herself. As the specific person she was at the end of this specific year, which was different from the person who had stood in this same place 12 months ago, not transformed in the dramatic way of stories that require their characters to become unrecognizable, but changed in the way of someone who has been through a thing that revealed what was already there, the way fire clarifies rather than creates. She stopped at the eastern boundary, where the property met the road, where the gate stood open on its hydraulic arm because she had gotten in the habit of leaving it open during the day. The road was empty. The trees on the other side were the neighbors' maples, blazing orange, a full 4 feet taller than they'd been when she'd first seen this property, 15 years ago as a woman in her 20s, driving with a man she'd just agreed to marry, looking at a piece of land and deciding she could build something here. She had built something here. The something she had built was not the something she had planned, and the building had cost more than she had known she was being charged. And the thing that stood at the end of it was not a marriage or an empire or any of the formal structures she had once believed were the point. It was her. Standing in October light at the eastern boundary of a property that was entirely hers, with a foundation that was doing real work for real people, and a therapist she trusted, and a lawyer she trusted, and enough clearance around herself to finally feel the edges of the space she occupied. It was enough. More than enough. It was, she understood, standing at the gate in the falling leaves, exactly as much as she had ever actually needed, which was not more than most people needed, just more than she had been given room to want. She turned and walked back toward the house. The oak trees stood along the eastern approach the way they always stood, enormous, rooted, indifferent to weather, and seasoned in the way of things that have been in the ground long enough to have stopped being negotiable. She had placed every one of them. She knew where each one stood because she had decided where each one stood. She walked between them in the amber afternoon, her boots on the fallen leaves, her breath even, her hands at her sides, not shaking, not gripping anything, not holding anything at all. Just a woman walking toward her own front door in the particular freedom of someone who has learned, at significant cost, that the only thing worth protecting was the thing she'd had all along. The door opened. She went inside.